The research station orbiting Xiphos 9 was a marvel of galactic engineering, a testament to the combined knowledge of dozens of intelligent species across the universe. Built within the gravitational boundary of the most hostile world ever discovered, it was designed for one purpose: to study death itself. Xiphos 9 was a killing ground, a planet that had refined survival into an impossible equation. Its gravity was nearly 4 times the galactic standard, enough to crush most creatures where they stood. Its atmosphere was a swirling maelstrom of acidic compounds that could dissolve organic tissue in seconds. The very ground was alive with biomechanical predation fields, invisible forces that actively hunted, dissolved, and reconstructed living matter into non-living substances. Every biological form subjected to these conditions had ceased to exist within seconds. And yet, standing before the reinforced entrance to the simulation chamber, Corporal Alex Reeve was casually cracking his knuckles, looking thoroughly unimpressed. Dr. Vrinkoll, the head scientist overseeing the experiment, stood a few meters away, his insectoid mandibles twitching with unease. He had spent decades studying planetary hazards and biological resilience. He had watched every living thing placed into the simulated environment perish in mere moments. The idea that this human, this Deathworlder, was about to walk through it unprotected was an absurdity that defied scientific reason. "You are certain you wish to proceed?" Dr. Vrinkoll asked again, his voice clicking through his species' natural chitinous vocal structures. Reeve grinned. "Yeah, Doc, you've asked me that like 3 times already. Let's get this over with." Around them, a group of researchers from various species observed with a mix of fascination and horror. Some had placed bets on how long Reeve would last. 30 seconds was the optimistic wager. No one believed he would make it to the other side. Dr. Vrinkoll hesitated one last time, then pressed a sequence on his control panel. The reinforced door to the simulation chamber hissed open, revealing a section of the station that had been engineered to replicate Xiphos 9's worst conditions. Inside, the environment was a nightmare, a deadly gauntlet of hazards that no organic being had ever endured. The moment Reeve stepped in, the airlock sealed behind him. From behind the thick observation glass, the scientists watched intently. The gravity field activated immediately, spiking from the comfortable galactic standard to the crushing 3.8 Gs of Xiphos 9. The shift was instantaneous, an invisible force that should have made movement nearly impossible. Reeve rolled his shoulders, adjusted his stance, and kept walking. Dr. Vrinkoll's antennae twitched in alarm. The internal monitors showed no signs of distress. Reeve's heart rate remained steady, his muscle activity normal. Under these conditions, most creatures would be struggling to breathe, their organs suffering from the sheer weight of existence. Instead, the human moved with casual ease, like someone walking down a hallway. The corrosive fog came next. Designed to replicate the atmosphere of Xiphos 9, it was a swirling mist of superheated acidic compounds that had liquefied every previous test subject within moments. The moment Reeve entered the fog, the chemical sensors flared with warning alerts. The acid should have begun dissolving his skin, eyes, and respiratory system immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath. His lungs expanded, his heartbeat remained steady. Then, with complete indifference, he exhaled and muttered, "Tastes like bad coffee." The research team froze in shock. Dr. Vrinkoll's claws tapped furiously at his console, rechecking the readings. No, this was impossible. The acid should have scorched his trachea, melted his alveoli, begun searing through his flesh. But there was no damage. What is his body made of?" a scientist whispered. The pulse disruptor field activated next. This was a final failsafe, a pure energy wave that deactivated biological nervous systems. It wasn't just a weapon, it was an instant kill switch. The energy pulse should have shut down his neural activity, rendering him lifeless in under a second. The system flashed. The biomonitoring equipment flatlined, not because Reeve was dead, but because the sensors no longer detected him as a biological entity. His nervous system was still active, his body still functional, yet the disruptor field registered nothing. Increase disruptor field intensity by 300%, Dr. Vrinkol ordered. The energy wave intensified, growing strong enough to kill a Rylac warbeast, a species considered one of the most durable in the galaxy. Reeve cracked his knuckles. Oh, that thing? Yeah. We humans call that static electricity. Kinda annoying, to be honest. Dr. Vrinkol felt his exoskeleton crawl with unease. The biomechanical predation field was the final test. This was a remnant of Xiphos 9's natural selection process, an energy lattice that unmade organic matter on a molecular level. It was not just a trap. It was a planetary defense system. Any living thing that entered this field was rewritten, its biological structure broken down and converted into lifeless matter. As Reeve stepped into the zone, the tendrils of the predation field latched onto him. For a moment, the entire research team stopped breathing. The field activated, beginning its work, unraveling his molecular structure, trying to overwrite him. Reeve paused. Then, with an almost casual shake of his shoulders, he pushed forward. The energy tendrils snapped apart like brittle threads. The predation field, an unstoppable force that had erased every other organism, began to fail. Dr. Vrinkol's mandibles trembled as the monitoring equipment flared with warnings. The field was collapsing, its function disrupted at a fundamental level. This wasn't just survival. This was rejection. The predation field, a mechanism designed to unmake life, was itself being overridden. The human walked through it unharmed. Reeve exited the chamber, rolling his shoulders as if he had just taken a light jog. Behind him, the entire research team stood in stunned silence. Dr. Vrinkol's claws trembled. What are you?" Reeve smirked and winked. "Deathworlder." Then he walked away, leaving behind a room full of shattered scientific understanding. The room remained deathly silent as the door sealed behind him. The only sound was the soft hum of cooling systems struggling to dissipate the residual energy left in the chamber. The gathered researchers, engineers, and xenobiologists from across the Galactic Union could do nothing but stare at the data screens, as if waiting for them to correct themselves, to declare that some kind of malfunction had occurred. The readings made no sense. The disruptor field had fired at full power, the predation matrix had engaged flawlessly, the corrosive fog had reached lethal saturation levels within seconds. Everything had been operating as intended, and yet the human had walked through it as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. Dr. Vrinkol's claws flexed and unflexed as he slowly turned away from the monitors and looked toward the other assembled scientists. He was not the only one struggling to form a coherent thought. Across the chamber, representatives from a dozen different species were displaying their own versions of shock. The reptilian U-Alketh had flattened their frills in sheer disbelief. The floating, jelly-like Yulthari blinked their bioluminescent patches erratically, and even the notoriously unflappable Koran diplomat, a species known for their emotionless pragmatism, was gripping the railing so tightly that it left indentations. Someone had to say something. Someone had to put words to what they had just witnessed. It was the Zellery delegate who spoke first, his soft voice buzzing through his external translator. I do not understand. The predation field does not fail. It is not a probability-based hazard. It is not a test of endurance. It simply reconfigures organic matter. Nothing living has ever... And yet, the Quran scientist interrupted, voice low and tight. He walked through it. Dr. Vrinkol exhaled sharply and turned to the security officers standing by the control deck. Get me every recorded data log of that test, every single frame, every single measurement. I want a complete breakdown of his biometrics, and I want a full diagnostic of the simulation chamber itself. We must assume, however unlikely, that some kind of malfunction occurred. I don't think it was a malfunction, Doctor, one of the junior researchers whispered. She was a member of the Celtari species, a diminutive race of amphibians known for their cold logic and precision. We calibrated the field twice before he entered. It was operating perfectly. Dr. Vrinkol did not like that answer. If the simulation had failed, it could be understood, accounted for, corrected. But if it had worked exactly as designed, then the only possible conclusion was that Corporal Alex Reeve, the human Deathworlder, had simply endured it through sheer biological resilience. That thought was deeply unsettling. The room broke into a low murmur as the implications set in. If the human could survive that, what else could he survive? Across the station, Alex Reeve had already made his way to the common area, where he found a water dispenser and poured himself a drink. His muscles ached slightly, not from the hazards, but from the sheer boredom of walking through them. He had expected something more dramatic, something more engaging. Instead, he had encountered mild annoyances at best. The gravity shift? He had felt worse during a week of weight training back on Earth. The corrosive fog? The air quality in some industrial cities was worse, especially if you factored in human lungs being built for filtering toxins. The pulse disruptor field? That had tickled, maybe. And the predation field? He wasn't even sure what that was supposed to do. But whatever it had attempted, his cells had apparently disagreed with it. He took another sip of water, stretching out his shoulders. He had the distinct feeling that he had just broken several centuries' worth of scientific understanding. That always made things interesting. He heard the doors hiss open behind him, followed by the unmistakable clicking footsteps of Dr. Vrinkol. The insectoid scientist approached cautiously, his movements slightly hesitant. "You do not appear fatigued." Reeve grinned. "Should I be?" Dr. Vrinkol hesitated, his antennae twitching in an unreadable pattern. That test was not designed for endurance. It was an absolute hazard. It should not have been survivable by any biological organism. And yet, the scientist let out a rattling exhale. And yet. He studied the human carefully, his gaze flicking to the barely damp sweat on his brow, the relaxed posture, the calm breathing. "Corporal Reeve, you were unaffected by the gravity shift. That alone should have placed immense strain on your skeletal and muscular systems." Humans adapt. He breathed in the corrosive fog. "Didn't taste great, but I've had worse. You walked through a pulse disruptor field. I don't even know what that was supposed to do." Dr. Vrinkol's mandibles clicked together audibly. It was designed to shut down biological nervous systems, instantly and painlessly. There is no known species in the Galactic Union that can endure it. Reeve shrugged. "Guess I'm the first." The scientist's mind whirred with calculations, attempting to process the sheer impossibility of what he was hearing. But the predation field was the one that truly disturbed him. That was not a weapon. That was not something designed to be endured. It rewrote biological matter, stripping away its organic nature and replacing it with non-living residue. It was a fundamental force of nature, an evolutionary adaptation of the deadliest planet known to the Union. Yet when it had touched the human, it had failed. The data was being processed even now, and preliminary readings suggested something terrifying. The field had begun rewriting Reeve's biological structure, but before it could complete the process, his cells fought back. Not with counter-energy, not with any detectable defense mechanism. They had simply refused to be altered. The data was being processed even now, and preliminary readings suggested something terrifying. The field had begun rewriting Reeve's biological structure, but before it could complete the process, his cells fought back. Not with counter-energy, not with any detectable defense mechanism. They had simply refused to be altered. "Your biology is..." Dr. Vrinkol struggled for words. "It is." Reeve chuckled. "Let me guess. Impossible." Yes. The human leaned back against the table, watching the scientist with a lazy smirk. "Welcome to humanity, Doc. We tend to make a habit of doing impossible things." Dr. Vrinkol tapped his claws against his forearm, thinking rapidly. He had studied human biology before. He knew of their immune systems, their regenerative capabilities, their redundant organs, their resilience to toxins, their ability to function across an absurd range of temperatures and environments. But this was beyond that. This was not survival. This was denial of death itself. He turned his gaze back toward the human. "You must allow us to study you further." Reeves snorted. "Yeah, that's not happening. This could change everything we know about organic survivability." "It usually does," Reeves said, finishing the last of his water. "Look, I get it. You want to know what makes humans tick. But trust me, Doc, you wouldn't be the first species to go down that rabbit hole. You're just hitting the shock and denial phase. Pretty soon you'll start coming up with theories about how we're some kind of anomaly, and then you'll run more tests, and then you'll realize that no, we're just like this." Dr. Vrinkol exhaled again. "And the predation field?" Reeve tilted his head. "I don't know what to tell you. Whatever it was trying to do, my body didn't like it, so it said no." The scientist stared at him. "You rejected a fundamental planetary death mechanism." Reeve just grinned. "Sounds about right." Dr. Vrinkol's mind raced. If humanity could resist Zephos 9's most lethal hazards, what else could they endure? What else had they survived in their evolutionary past? He suddenly felt a profound, unsettling realization settle over him. Perhaps humans weren't adapted for survival. Perhaps they were adapted for war. And the galaxy had no idea what it had just invited into its ranks. Vrinkol had spent his entire life devoted to the study of biological limitations. Every species in the Galactic Union had a threshold, a point where their evolutionary advantages ceased to matter, where the laws of nature dictated the inevitability of their demise. For most, that threshold was predictable. Lack of oxygen, extreme heat or cold, nerve-disrupting pulses, corrosive atmospheres. Even the most resilient organisms eventually reached a breaking point. That was the foundation of biological study. It was a universal truth. But tonight, as he sat alone in his laboratory analyzing the impossible data collected from Corporal Alex Reeves' trial, Dr. Vrinkol felt something he had not experienced in a long time. The human had shattered every known metric for survivability, not through technology or special preparation, but simply by being human. The evidence was irrefutable. The predation field, designed to deconstruct organic matter on a molecular level, had failed. The energy disruptor, meant to deactivate biological nervous systems, had registered him as inorganic. Even the corrosive fog, which had melted through the flesh of every test subject before him, had been inhaled by the human with no measurable effect. He had not just survived. He had dismissed it all as minor inconveniences. Dr. Vrinkol tapped his claws against the console, watching the biometric readings again. The human's heartbeat had remained steady throughout the test. There had been no surge of stress hormones, no indication of panic. There wasn't even a notable fluctuation in neural activity. The only notable shift occurred when he exited the chamber, where there was a brief but measurable uptick in brain activity, most likely from mild amusement. The human had found the experiment funny. Dr. Vrinkol exhaled sharply, his antennae twitching in frustration. There had to be a rational explanation, something he had overlooked, some hidden biological adaptation unique to humans. If they could isolate it, analyze it, understand it, then perhaps they could redefine the very limits of life itself. His thoughts were interrupted by the chime of an incoming transmission. With a flick of his clawed fingers, the holographic display flickered to life. A familiar figure materialized before him. High Administrator Zelvaran, a member of the Zelari species known for their meticulous governance over the scientific institutions of the Union. Zelvaran's elongated features were set in an expression of professional curiosity, though there was a subtle tension in his translucent chitinous skin. "Dr. Vrinkol," the administrator greeted, "I have received your preliminary report on the human's test." Dr. Vrinkol straightens. "Yes, Administrator. I assume you wish to discuss the implications?" "I wish to discuss the impossibilities within your data." Zelvarin corrected, his compound eyes narrowing. Your report suggests that the human was unaffected by conditions that should have annihilated any biological entity. That is accurate. Explain. Dr. Vrinkol hesitated before responding. We have yet to determine the exact mechanisms that allowed him to withstand the hazards, but there are several hypotheses. Human cellular structures may possess an unknown resistance to external manipulation. Their nervous systems may operate on an undocumented frequency that negates standard disruptor fields. There is also a possibility that their immune system is already known to be uniquely aggressive, somehow recognized and counteracted the predation field's effects in real time. Zelvan's mandibles clicked softly in contemplation. And yet, none of these hypotheses are supported by existing biological theory. Oh, then you are telling me that we have encountered a species that operates outside of known biological theory? Dr. Vrinkol hesitated. The words felt dangerous to speak aloud. Yes. The administrator remained silent for a long moment. What do the humans say about this? Dr. Vrinkol let out a slow breath. Corporal Reeve seemed unconcerned by his own results. He dismissed the hazards as relatively unremarkable. Dismissed them. Yes, Administrator. There was another long pause before Zelvaran finally spoke. Doctor, I am authorizing classified priority status for all further studies on the human species. This information is not to be made public until we understand exactly what we are dealing with. I want continuous observation on this, Corporal Reeve, and I want a full genetic analysis of human biology immediately. Dr. Vrinkol hesitated. Administrator, if I may speak freely, I believe there is something deeply unsettling about all of this. Zelvarin's compound eyes studied him. Elaborate. The scientist's claws tapped against the console. The Galactic Union has long classified humanity as a Deathworlder species, but that designation has always been based on statistical analysis, high gravity tolerance, adaptability, environmental resilience. We assumed they were simply on the upper end of survivability, but I fear we may have made a fundamental miscalculation. In what way? Dr. Vrinkol exhaled. Perhaps humans do not survive death traps because of their resilience. He turned to the data screen, where the energy readings of the predation field collapse were still displayed. Perhaps they survive because they are inherently incompatible with them. Zelvaran's expression darkened. You are suggesting that human biology is not merely resistant, but... Dr. Vrinkol nodded. Antithetical to non-existence. There was another long silence. Finally, Zelvarin's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Doctor, I want you to consider the implications of what you are suggesting. If humans are, as you put it, antithetical to non-existence, what does that mean for the nature of their evolution? Dr. Vrinkol did not answer immediately. He had been asking himself the same question. Every species in the galaxy had evolved under conditions that selected for survival within a certain range of parameters: oxygen breathers, methane breathers, cold dwellers, heat dwellers. But all species were ultimately bound by the same natural laws. They lived, they thrived, they perished when conditions exceeded their limits. But humans did not seem to have those limits. Was it possible that human evolution had selected not just for survival, but for absolute persistence? Dr. Vrinkol swallowed hard. I don't know, Administrator, but I believe it is something we must uncover before it is too late. Zelvarin studied him for a long moment. And continue your research, Doctor. Report directly to me. The transmission ended, leaving Dr. Vrinkol alone with his thoughts. Across the station, Corporal Alex Reeve was already back in his quarters, reclining on his cot with his hands behind his head. He knew exactly what was happening in the research wing, the frantic discussions, the rushed reports, the uneasy realizations settling into the minds of the scientists. He had seen it before. Humans had been part of the Galactic Union for only a few decades, and yet every major scientific institution had gone through this exact phase at some point. It always started with disbelief. Then came the tests. Then came the horrified understanding. He wasn't offended. It wasn't their fault. Other species didn't think like humans did. They didn't evolve on a world that actively tried to kill them every second of their existence. They didn't know what it was like to be a species that had clawed its way to dominance not through superior physiology, but through sheer refusal to die. They didn't understand that for humans pain was just a suggestion, that limits were just a starting point, that when the universe told humans something was impossible, humans had a very simple response. "Watch me." Reeve smirked, reaching over to turn off the lights. He knew this was just the beginning. The real fun started when the scientists stopped questioning the data and started fearing it.